Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to pay tribute to Auntie Joan Hendricks. I've just found out about her passing. She was one of the integral members of the reconciliation movement in the 90s, a very good friend. I think we had the honour of writing a prayer together, which I don't know that many people have done. And of course, two other people I'd like to acknowledge is Auntie Pam Mam and Uncle Sam, who also were great supporters of us. And also thank you, Rosalie, for the very glamorous photo on the flyer. I've got so much teasing about it that it's been a bit of a laugh. I don't generally go out on Australia Day, so Peter, you've done well. It's not been my practice since 2000, and I don't usually participate in activities on the 26th of January. I use the time to reflect on our history and past. The speech I'm giving today is actually about the bridge walks, because that was what I was told to give it about. So there's a bit of reconciliation movement in there, but it's more about the bridge walks and where we've come from. Friday night I had the privilege of attending a showing of the film The Australian Dream, and it caused me great sadness, as I think anyone watching this documentary would attest to. In 2000 we had such hope for the future. After 10 years of a process which brought our country together, surely the only way to go was up. Not so. The bridge walks were remarkable. The council came up with the concept in 1995, and the thought then was that we would have one bridge walk only in Sydney, and that the First Nations people would be at one end and the rest of us would be at the other, and we were going to meet in the middle, which we all thought was a bit of a silly idea. So they got rid of that idea fairly quickly, and we changed it to what we all know. Can I ask how many people, anyone here that walked across the bridge in Sydney? Sydney? And how many walked across the William Jolly Bridge? So there's still a lot of us. So just a bit about the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation. The way it worked was that there was an original council which was made up of 26 people, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians, and it was, and in each state they had a state coordinator. Enter the Foleys, and I say the Foleys because it wasn't just me, it was my husband and the 8 children, and we were a party, you know. And so each state had an eminent persons group, and Auntie Joan was on that group, Auntie Flo up the back was on that group, and we also had people such as politicians. We had bipartisan support, we had the Mining Council, the pastoralists, the environmentalists, all the political parties. So it was a pretty powerful group of people. Unfortunately today we can't get that to happen now. And I'm telling you this because it's very relevant to how the bridge walks happened. The AFRs, as we were called, the Australians for Reconciliation, didn't like the idea of meeting in the middle. We strongly pushed for a walk together and for walks in every state. We won that battle, and we then had the first walk across Sydney Harbour Bridge on the 28th of May, and the walk in Queensland, of course, was on the 4th of June. Bridge walks, believe it or not, are not simple things to organise. And I understand that, Peter, you're organising one soon.
Reconciliation Queensland, maybe.
You may not after this. In Sydney there were numerous state and federal government departments to negotiate with. It's no easy thing to close the Sydney Harbour Bridge for any period of time, let alone for a day, which was what it turned out to be. And you've got to realise we didn't think anyone would come. We thought, oh yeah, you know, we were a bit worried there'd be us and the dignitaries and, you know, our families, and that would be it, because we honestly didn't know how the community was feeling. And of course, you know, John Howard was very anti the walk. He wouldn't walk. he had upset everybody, so we didn't know what would happen. But anyway, we got permission, and they had to, things that we had to consider was transport for elders, police, security, toilets, entertainers, water, ambulance services, lost children. We had to negotiate with the Sydney City Council, the transport authorities, the local traditional owners, the state government and the federal government. And after we did all that, we got to a point where we could do it. And then we had to sell, but that wasn't all. We had to sell the concept. We had to talk to the reconciliation groups and to the traditional owners and the peak bodies and the land councils and the legal services and the health services. And a committee was set up, and Linda Burney and her partner at the time, Rick Farley, were the people that drove that. And that committee was very high-powered. It had the Premier, the Police Commissioner, the Lord Mayor, and the traditional owners of Sydney, and they were the people that got the thing happening. Memories on the day, there's some funny ones. One of the first was the elders, who were determined to walk across the bridge, right or wrong. I mean, the fact that it was, an enormous walk was not going to deter them, and I had the job of trying to get them into golf buggies so that, they could go across. Well, I can assure you, trying to get Faith Bandler into a golf buggy when she doesn't want to, there's no way possible, And Jackie Huggins' sister, she was also there, and I remember she saying, no, I can do it. But eventually we got them down there, and they sort of managed about 50 metres and asked for the golf buggies, because when they saw the length of it when they got there, they realised it was not as easy as they thought. But they were so excited, we were all so excited, and of course they all thought they were Superman or Superwoman and they could do anything. So we finally got them in the buggies, we went down there, and the sign was given and off we went. The elders in the buggies went first, then the council members and the dignitaries, and then us. And I walked across with Meg Lees, who was then leader of the Democrats, Ernie Dingo and Shay Cockatoo Collins, and being a Queenslander I didn't have a clue who this fella was, but apparently he was a pretty important footballer. And it was just euphoric. I can remember we got to the halfway mark and Ernie said, turn around. And we turned around and we looked back, and there was like 100 metres, I suppose, between the first walkers and then the next walkers. And all we saw was people. It was just something you couldn't describe. And then someone said, look up, and we saw the trains. And I asked my kids what did they remember, and they said the trains, because the trains were coming every 5 minutes and they were full. And people were hanging out the windows, and they had Aboriginal flags, they were flying out the windows, and they were packed to the limit, and everyone was waving at us. And then they'd drop them off at the North Sydney station, and they'd go back and they'd be empty. And then 5 minutes later they'd be full again, and this just continued non-stop. The walk took around about an hour. I might be exaggerating, it was probably a lot longer than that, but anyway. And I think that was because we were in the front walkers. My husband and the other kids, they took a long time to get across because of so many people. And I think people took their time too. People were talking to people they'd never met before. They were chatting about what was important and what wasn't important, and then there'd be cries for treaty, and then someone would say something about John Howard and they'd all boo, and it was a real... They came in on the train, and they're all standing up, and next to them was Bob Carr and his wife, and there was absolutely no room for being precious or being a dignitary or anything like that. Everybody on that day was equal, and everybody was treated as equal. And I think the original plan was the bridge would be shut for 2 hours, and I think first walk we started about 7. It finished at 2 p.m. or 3 p.m, so Sydney traffic was just disrupted for an enormous amount of time. I actually think John Howard helped us, because he was so anti it, and he made such a big thing about being anti. I think people thought, well, stuff it. If John Howard, I'm going to do it just to spite him. So I'm not sure whether some of them walked for the right reason, but anyway. And the speech he made at Corroboree 2000 the day before was appalling. So, you know, that angered people as well. The other key memories I have of that day was Jimmy Little singing at Darling Harbour, and so many of the female elders sitting there greeting Jimmy like he was the world's greatest sex symbol sort of thing, and all jumping up and having it was so great. So we all went home from that feeling very buoyed and thinking, okay, well, if they can get 250 to 500,000, the figure, you know, we should get a reasonable turnout. So the bridge walk in Brisbane we started planning about 12 months before. As we were doing the consultations for the document of reconciliation, we talked to local groups, regional groups, we encouraged walks, and I think in the end there was something like 26 different walks all over Queensland. I know they walked in Toowoomba, they walked in Mundubra, Little Mundubra, they had a walk up in Gladstone, Rocky, Cairns, Townsville, Innisfail, yeah, and I think there were walks that we didn't even know about. But one thing I knew was that if anything was going to happen in Brisbane, I needed to talk to Sam Watson. And I was absolutely terrified. I'm thinking, what reaction am I going to get from Sam? So we have this meeting, and I sort of tell him very gingerly what I thought was going to happen and what we wanted to do. And he said, oh, that's great, this is how we'll do it. And of course, he took over the committee then, so it was fantastic, and he helped us a lot. And of course, reconciliation isn't for everyone. You know, some people embrace it, some make it, you know, part of their life, and other people don't like it. And at this point, I'm going to acknowledge my sister over here, Cheryl, who for many years we had great arguments over reconciliation, but I think she's forgiven me now.
I'm not sure about that.
And of course, the obvious comment we'd get is, why do we have to reconcile, you know? But Sam was excited, so that was good, it happened. Next stop was Jim Sawley and Sterling Hinchcliffe, who was his chief of staff. And originally we wanted to do the Story Bridge, you know, far more salubrious Story Bridge. But the thing with a bridge walk is there's two things you need, somewhere to start and somewhere to finish. And you need to have a big place to start and a big place to finish, because when the people come, they've got to be able to wait and whatever before their turn to start walking. So that was why William Jolly was the bridge that was used, because you had the big area at West End and then we walked into King George Square. So we got that sorted. We had that answer. We went off and we were going to shut George Street, and we told the police, oh, you know, probably an hour, that's all we'll need, maybe 2 at the most. How many people? Oh, maybe 2,000. I'd be surprised if we got any more than that. So we had the committee, and there was Sam, there was Jim Sawley, Grace, Uncle Bob Anderson, Arnie Flo, Sterling, and Inspector Terry Tyler, Rita Nona, Billy Lower and Jackie Huggins, and we were the people that sort of made it happen. And you know, we'd meet awfully, I think it was weekly in some, you know, for a while. And as I said, I can clearly remember the police saying, how many people do you think we said 2,000, we'd be very lucky if we got 5,000. Secretly we were hoping we got a lot more than that, but we weren't going to say that to them. So Brisbane City supplied the toilets, the entertainment, the water, buses for elders and those who couldn't work, lots of police, mounted police, ambulance services, volunteers to direct the ward. And one of the biggest issue or not was working out who would walk first, you know, because people's egos are big, and you know, who's more important than each other. And in the end, unbeknownst to us, the mounted police had turned up, and they just took their place in the front of the march without any sort of reference to us, which upset quite a few people. But the job of leading the march ended up with Cheryl's boys, Jagger and Jargum. So this one, even though she did, and the girls, who doesn't believe in reconciliation, ended up being one of the first walkers across the bridge. And then Uncle Bob and the Premier and Flo's granddaughter Brooke and my daughter Rada were up the front because they'd received the document of reconciliation and gave it to the Governor, and they were going to hand over a reef at the City Hall. So they were up the front as well, and the rest of us sort of followed in behind the elders and everybody. And it was interesting because the police were on either side of the bridge, you know, watching us. And you know, this is only 10 years since Joe, and you know, where if we gathered more than 2 or 3 people, we'd be arrested, you know. And Uncle Bob, mate, looked at me and he said, not so long ago the police would have had the batons and they would have been beating the hell out of us, you know. And that's true, that's what would have happened. So it was a sign of change, even though the police still thought they needed to be there in great force. I remember trying to get people into order to get the march started. It was like trying to herd sheep. At the time I had 7 of my 8 kids there. One of them wasn't born. And I was running around like a maniac, and we were at the front and there wasn't many people, and then I said to Peter Beattie, can you keep an eye on the kids whilst I grab Uncle Bob? So I raced off and find Uncle Bob and come back, and there's Peter chatting away, no kids. And I look at him and I said, where's the kids? And he looks very sheepish, and his wife Heather said, you might be a good Premier, but you're a lousy babysitter. And then we looked up and we found them up a tree somewhere and had to then get them all down. The main thing that got the march going though was the Eminent Persons Group. I can't tell you enough what support they gave, because each member on that group represented a sector. So Grace and Claire Moore worked with the unions. Dr. Bowie from the Vietnamese community got the Vietnamese community out, and there was huge numbers of the Vietnamese community that marched. Michael Yao got the Chinese community together, even with the Chinese dragon. Nick Zinnius and Uri Tamal had all the ethnic community covered. Troy Casadale, he used his wife's contacts, and we got radio stations to provide free advertising. I remember Jamie Dunn and Agro were telling people to walk, that their family would be walking, and so people were then coming forward. We paid for no publicity. It just, word of mouth, it just got around. And after the Sydney March, everyone wanted to talk to us, you know. It was Queensland Churches Together, which was Arnie Jones' group. They got all the faith groups there. They marched. And then Uncle Sam, of course, used the Murray Grapevine. In fact, I think every Aboriginal group in southeast Queensland was there. The road closure was for 2 hours. 6 hours later, we opened George Street back up. The police commissioner came up to us and said, 5,000 people. I thought you said 5,000 people at the most. And I think the recorded figure is 70,000. We didn't know where to look. As I said, the obvious. I guess there was a few more than we anticipated. And of course the march was supposed to go from the bridge to King George Square, where there was stuff happening, and then later Jib Sawley had put a free concert on down at the Botanical Gardens, but King George Square sort of filled up in the first half hour, so we then had to close the whole of George Street so people could get down to the gardens, because there was nowhere for them to go. It was just total chaos. But anyway, we did the reef laying at King George Square, and I've been trying to figure out, and that might be something Q can do, is what happened to the plaque that was in King George Square. It was first put there when the other 4 plaques were there, and it was when we welcomed the Aboriginal community into Brisbane and gave them the keys to Brisbane, and there was a plaque laid there then. And when they dug up King George Square, I have no idea where it went, and I've been trying to find out ever since, because it's a really, really important part of our history. It's something that, you know, we need to know where it is, and you know, like we do over at the Gap, we need to, you know, recognise that. So in the end, so I asked people their memories. The kids, the younger ones don't remember much at all. The other ones, they remember the people. And I met a guy last night who said to me that he walked across with his parents. He was at the motel I was staying at, and he said he was about 10, and he said, I can remember seeing the big sorry across the sky, which no one knew where that came from, but I can tell you now that Jim Sawley paid for that personally to have it up there. But at the time it was all very hush-hush. A lot of people remember the joy of walking with people, you know, people they'd never met, and talking to them, walking side by side. I can remember a group of people that came down from Gladstone, and they had that reconciliation quilt, I think, and they'd made this quilt, and then there was another group that came from Rocky, and they had this massive big Aboriginal flag. It was just huge. But it was such an important thing for the Aboriginal population, and I think it went a long way to healing things. And you know, all the planning, heartache, nervousness, it was something, if you're involved, it's something you'll never forget. These things are so important to us as a community. Cheryl and I have just been going around the state talking to people about the treaty, on the path to treaty process. And one thing that came across, which no matter where we were, was the need for healing. Everyone says to us, no healing, no treaty. We have to heal. We have to tell the true history of this country. We have to acknowledge this land was taken by force. We have to acknowledge that Aboriginal people have never ceded sovereignty, and we have to hear everybody's stories and then move on and teach those stories to people in their regional areas. You know, kids growing up in Toowoomba need to know about the Battle of One Tree Hill and what happened, and people in Rockhampton need to know about the massacres that happened there. We can never move on, I don't believe, as a state unless we do that, and that's the number one recommendation that we as the Treaty Working Group have made to the government, is that a process of healing and reconciliation take place. So, just sort of, I think in organising these bridge walks, and this is something, Peter, the whole process of making it happen is part of the reconciliation process. You know, I make laugh of it, but the fact that you've got to get all these people around a room and you have to talk about what this means, people that, you know, wouldn't, in those days the police would never sit at the table and have a civil conversation with Uncle Sam, but they did, they had to. And that whole process was I think more important than the walk itself almost, because that was the process that got people talking together and made people realise why we were doing it. And also it was a demonstration of a commitment of a society, our society, that we would treat each other with respect, with mutual admiration. And it was also a symbol of acknowledgement of a culture who's been here for 65,000 years and is the oldest living culture in the world. So why haven't we moved forward? We left 2000 on a high. I think we haven't had the leadership. The council was the leaders, they went. We've not really had in any form a group that can take that forward. And I think, you know, when it finished in 2000, there was 120 reconciliation groups in this state, and they were all active. But, you know, I don't know how many there is now, but I don't think there's 120. And they were all doing stuff in their local area. But I think if there's not the impetus, there isn't people that can, just simple things like the council, you could provide guest speakers, you could provide material to people to hand out. You know, there's a whole range of things that the council was able to do that, you know, it made it very hard for organisations. When ARC Youth first took over, they had no funding. I don't know how long, but it was a long time before government finally decided that they would give them funding. So, you know, by stealth, John Howard got rid of us. You know, he did it by, okay, you know, we've done this, it's all over now, 10 years have passed, we don't need to fund this anymore, we believe in practical reconciliation, whatever that means. And that's, I think, one of the reasons. There has not been leadership from both sides of the governments for this process, and I think that's something that I think we've got a change happening there. I have to congratulate Jackie Trad for taking on this treaty process. She didn't have to do it, no one asked her to. It's a tough one, you know. Not everybody here thinks the same way as we do in this room. We can assure you there's a lot of people out there that we've met that, you know, have very, very archaic views of how the world should be. And as I said, you know, the stories, when we were moving up and down the state, what shocked me, I think, is that I hadn't been back to those communities for 20 years since we did the document of reconciliation. And the stories we were hearing then, 20 years later, were the same stories we were hearing back then. Very little has changed. You know, we're going to communities where in the wet season they haven't got enough food to feed people. And that's Cowan, you know, community just outside of Cairns. Napranum, right next door to one of the biggest bauxite mines in the country. And the council is struggling to provide housing for the people that are there. You know, we met people there that struggle every day of their lives just because they are Aboriginal, and that shouldn't be happening in our society today. And then today coming over, we had a very strange experience. I had to persuade Cheryl to come and hold my hand. And in the end she came, and we got in the car and we met this lovely Uber driver who started talking to us, and we were talking about what we were going to. And she said, sort of midway through, she said, I'm Aboriginal, you know. I know nothing about my family. I've tried to find it and I've given up. And, you know, my husband was from India, and, you know, she talked about what colonisation meant for his family. And we talked to her along the way, and when we got out, we were all in tears. It was just the most emotional thing. But it's for those people that we have to keep doing this, because that woman deserves to know who she is. She deserves to know who her family are, and she deserves to be part of that family. And, you know, she doesn't know where to go. And I think the process that we're setting out for treaty, I hope, will change some of that. And you know, to think that someone as prominent as Adam Goodes can be brought to the brink because of racism says a lot about Australia today. You know, and you know, communities shouldn't be living in third and in some cases fourth world conditions. But as I said, one of the most important things we found in the treaty conversations is the need for healing. Healing first, treaty next. And I cannot reiterate enough the need for the state to go through a truth-telling and healing process for both First Nations and wider Queenslanders. You know, that was the other thing. Queenslanders come up and tell us about their grandparents and their great-grandparents and the things they've been told, and they've kept it in their minds and, you know, felt enormous shame and not known what to do with that. So it's something that will benefit everybody. So just to finish, when South African President Nelson Mandela came to Australia, he stated the bridge walk was evidence of a country wanting to heal itself and deal with the health of the past. Council member Archie Barton, who was from Woomera, and his area had been affected by the nuclear testing, said to me, "This Aboriginal race relations in this country is like a large boil which needs to be lanced for the poison to leave." And I think that's where we're at the moment. This is what we're dealing with now, and I think the time has come. I think we should move forward as a nation and a state and work towards a treaty. And it's very appropriate to, in a way, it's appropriate to give this speech on the 26th of January, an anniversary of the invasion of this land. And we need to remember that this land was never ceded, sovereignty was never ceded, and we should join with the First Nations, remembering the NAIDOC theme for this year, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you very much.